Well, good afternoon. I'm Maria Korsnick with the Nuclear Energy Institute. Thank you for joining our panel today. Today we're going to focus on policy measures to promote a clean energy future. So if you think about all the different conversations that are playing out at an organization and an event like this, to really lock those in, it really needs to translate into policy. And that's some of the things that we're going to talk about today. I have a wonderful panel today. Let me start by introducing them. To my right is Dr. Katie Huff, and Dr. Huff serves as the Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy. Before joining the Department of Energy, she was an assistant professor in the Department of Nuclear, Plasma, and Radiological Engineering at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And she was also a Blue Waters assistant professor with the National Center for Supercomputing Applications. And she received her PhD in nuclear from the University of Wisconsin and her undergraduate in physics. So very welcome. Glad to see you, Dr. Huff. And to her right is Deanne Cameron. Deanne is head of the Nuclear Technology Development and Economics Division at the OECD, Nuclear Energy Agency. In her role at the NEA, she leads an expert team of economists and scientists that support nuclear energy policy developments among the NEA member countries. And they provide authoritative assessments and analyses in the areas of nuclear economics, financing, as well as nuclear technology, innovation, and the fuel cycle. So big welcome. Thank you, Deanne, for joining us. And we also have Gary Rose. Mr. Rose is currently the Vice President of New Nuclear Growth at Ontario Power Generation, New Nuclear Domestic and International Strategy. In this capacity, he's responsible for the development of opportunities to deploy new nuclear in Ontario, while working with other jurisdictions in Canada and internationally to develop opportunities for nuclear expansion. So we look forward to hearing from you. And not on the stage, but he will be providing a taped message, is Dr. Jun Arima. Dr. Arima is a project professor at the Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Tokyo, and he's a board member of the Japan Atomic Industrial Forum, also known as JIFE. He graduated from the University of Tokyo with a degree in economics and joined the Ministry of International Trade and Industry. He later became the Deputy Director General for Global Environmental Affairs at the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, and then became the Director General of the Japan External Trade Organization in London. So, my gosh, we have a lot of great talent here that we're going to be able to spend some time with here this afternoon. So, as I said, we're talking now about how are we taking some of these conversations and really locking them in from a policy perspective. And you all represent, obviously, different geographical areas. And perhaps what we'll do is we'll start with Dr. Arima, who will be by video, and he has a prepared statement. If you guys could play that video, please.
At the Green Transformation meeting in August 2022, for discussing green energy transformation, Prime Minister Kishida expressed the following intention from the viewpoint of securing stable power supply. Number one, restarting of all 17 nuclear power plants, of which safety has been confirmed by the Nuclear Regulatory Authority. Number two, maximizing the use of existing nuclear power plants, such as extending the operation period beyond 60 years, on the premise of ensuring safety. Number three, development and construction of next generation innovative reactors incorporating new safety mechanisms. Until now, the government has been pursuing the research and development of innovative reactors, and nuclear innovation is among 14 key priority areas under Green Growth Strategy towards 2050. However, it deserves attention that Prime Minister has explicitly referred to construction for the first time. It is logical to consider construction of new nuclear power plant so long as the government is promoting a nuclear R&D. Unless there is a clear vision of deploying innovative reactors in the market, private sector will not be interested in engaging in such research and development. Japan is not connected to its neighboring countries by power grid or gas pipelines. It does not have any domestic fossil fuel resources. With respect to renewable energy, it also has a handicap due to mountainous land area and also deep sea water. Under such condition, aiming at carbon neutrality, ruling out nuclear power will significantly raise Japan's energy cost, which is already very much high. And this will have a negative implication for national and economic security. Nuclear technologies, domestic technologies accumulated by Japanese engineers over decades. If the curve-stuck situation to date continues, expertise and human resources for these precious domestic technologies could be lost. So in this regard, Prime Minister Kishida's remarks are very relevant and timely, and I think this is the first step towards normalization of Japanese energy policy making, which has been up to now distorted by anti-nuclear fundamentalism and renewable energy fundamentalism. However, there are still many challenges to overcome. Prime Minister himself should exercise his political leadership in securing understanding from local communities and local governments, and consensus needs to be built within ruling parties. Nuclear regulation should be more efficient without sacrificing safety. Some policy incentives, such as regulated asset base in the UK, would be necessary for securing necessary investment for nuclear and a liberalized electricity market. All of these call for Prime Minister's strong leadership and his devotion of political capital. Finally, let me briefly touch upon innovative reactors being discussed at the Nuclear-Related Council currently. A technology roadmap is presented for introduction from 2040 to 2050 for 5 reactor types, namely innovative light water reactor, small modular reactor, high temperature gas-cooled reactor, and fast reactor, and nuclear fusion. Issues related to development of innovative reactors are clarification of direction, preparation of development budget and facilities, and enabling business environment for developing innovative reactors. And on the other hand, nuclear reactor manufacturers are developing SMR technology with subsidies from government, and expectations are high for the commercialization of SMRs with a view to overseas expansion in the future. And we also hope that efforts aimed at deploying SMRs in the third country through Japan-US collaboration will lead to future expansion of the SMR market. Investment by JGC and IHI in SMR development by NuScale in 2021 is such an example.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. And let's now turn to the panel. So again, we talked about, and I know all of you are engaged to some level in policy and policy discussion. So I'm going to start by just going down the line here and maybe just reflect on, say, over the past year or so, what are some of the more significant sort of policy changes that you've seen in your area of the world, and just sort of give us a view of, sort of why do you think it's significant, and sort of how do you, as you look ahead, how significant do you think it is for climate and for nuclear? And Dr. Huff, I'll start with you.
All right. Thank you so much. I think, it has been a huge year in the United States for nuclear power, just bigger than ever. In particular, with the really forward-leaning Biden-Harris administration position that nuclear is part of the energy mix we'll need, it's really, I think, emboldened a lot of the private capital as well as political enthusiasm around nuclear. These things feed off of each other, and of course, sort of a bipartisanship about nuclear led to some of that full-throated endorsement. But what it really looks like is that, we've passed some really historic climate legislation in the United States. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the Inflation Reduction Act. These included things like $6 billion over the next 10 years for civil nuclear credits to keep existing plants open if they're in competitive markets. There's, actually $20 billion for various clean energy demonstration and research hubs, within which there's $8 billion for hydrogen. And some nuclear hydrogen will certainly be a part of those hydrogen hubs. The Inflation Reduction Act has $700 million for high-assay, low-enriched uranium. And there's, an incredible amount of Inflation Reduction Act tax credits for production around nuclear, as well as production of hydrogen at $3 a kilogram. It really gives a lot of carrots to folks interested in engaging in nuclear. And, in the United States, at the federal level, we don't have a lot of sticks, right? So at the state level or at the Public Utility Commission level, you might see the passage of, clean energy portfolio laws or renewable energy portfolio laws. But at the federal level, we tend not to do that, right? What we have at the federal level is carrots. We can incentivize business, and we have to hope that the state policies and public utility commissions come along with that. And so we're really using, dollars to incentivize, and I think that's been really, really large. I think in particular in the United States, we're excited about advanced reactor demonstrations. We have 11 reactors supported by our Advanced Reactor Demonstration Program and our Carbon-Free Power Project together. Among these, there are 3 total demonstrations of advanced reactors, including the NuScale Small Modular Light Water Reactor, the TerraPower Natrium Reactor, and the X-Energy XE100, all of which we're hoping will be built by the end of the decade to contribute to the future of advanced nuclear. So it's a really huge year.
Well, great. Thank you, Dr. Huff. And I echo the amount of legislation, conversation, the tax credits alone that the administration has really pushed through working with Congress, game-changing. And it's not only game-changing for the United States, but you saw that once the United States made that, and hopefully, Gary, you'll mention it when we get to you, because then Canada says, well, wait a minute, the U.S. is doing something. And I think as Deanne, shares next, I think there's, evidence as well that sort of Europe's also in the conversation. So I think this is a good problem to have. As each country is starting to do something, they're paying attention to what the other person is, and I think it's sort of challenging a bit to do even more. Deanne, give us your thoughts.
Thank you, first of all, to NEI for organizing this event and to IAEA for hosting us here. Yes, so at the Nuclear Energy Agency, we're an international organization. We have 34 member countries that collectively represent approximately 81% of global installed nuclear capacity. So we do have that vantage point to be able to sort of take stock of what's happening around the world. Clearly, in the last 12 months, there is a momentum that has not been there for decades in the nuclear sector. Coming out of COP26, which was really already a big step forward for nuclear in the climate conversation globally, as the timelines for getting to net zero are fast approaching. There was already a growing momentum and seriousness about the conversation for nuclear energy projects, but that has been compounded by the energy security crisis that comes out of the war in Ukraine. And so now you have the two crises working together to create this global context that is really forcing a seriousness to the conversation that has not been there for decades, a seriousness to the conversation about what are the actual options available to us to decarbonize while maintaining security, affordability, flexibility, dispatchability. So we are seeing big announcements coming out of a number of our member countries. Canada, we're going to hear from Gary from OPG, so I won't dwell on that, but Canada is making big announcements with its SMR action plan. The U.S., we just heard from Katie, is really leading in the innovation and R&D space on Generation 4 technologies. France has made announcements about a significant number of large-scale new builds. Japan is bringing reactors back online as aggressively, as ambitiously as it can. Korea has had a reversal in its policy about the phase out of nuclear. The UAE has just been a shining light for the world in terms of showcasing how nuclear can be built rapidly, on schedule, on time, on budget. But then, those might be the countries we expected to come on board, right? But we're seeing announcements from countries that were maybe a little bit more surprising. And this is where it gets very interesting. So the Netherlands, announcements in Netherlands about new builds. Belgium announcing extension or long-term operations and announcing money for R&D into SMRs. Even Germany reopening the conversation about reversing its phase out. Nothing announced yet, but reopening the conversation that people thought was closed, and other countries as well. So, and for me, what it really is about. What that really signals is that the closer we get to our deadlines for decarbonization, the more we have to acknowledge which parts of the conversation were a little bit aspirational and a little bit based in aspiration and fantasy versus which are the concrete options that we can build today and which are the proven technologies that we know how to build today. And as those timelines come closer and closer, nuclear becomes increasingly obviously a part of the solution.
Sure, exciting times in Canada as well. But when we started to talk about policy, I want to stop for a second and just look backwards. In 2003, Ontario had 23% of our generation was from coal. We made the decision in 2003 to shut down all our coal, and that was achieved through our nuclear fleet. So we, in 2014, have 0% coal, and 60% of our generation in Ontario is nuclear. Canada has 19 nuclear plants, 18 of them are in Canada. So as we shift forward, we certainly have support of our nuclear fleet in Ontario, and over the last year there's been a lot happening at the federal level as well. Like the US, the federal sets the overall policy and the regulations, and each of the provinces in Canada set the generation profile for how that province will move forward. Canada rolled out an SMR roadmap, an SMR action plan, which brought together industries, utilities, etc., to work together on deploying SMRs. 4 provinces have signed up to work together in a strategic initiative, being Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, and New Brunswick, to work together to make sure that we're able to deploy SMRs as soon as possible, support each other in doing that. On a federal level, the last 3 weeks have been very exciting, and I think you're right, there's some country-to-country competition. Pass the mic game. No, that's right. Yeah. So the support from the federal government first starts off about a year ago. The federal budget put more funding in for our regulator, the CNSC, to build capacity to evaluate new technologies and be ready to deploy, license and deploy. You can't move forward with nuclear technology without the regulator being on side and supporting that. Very recently, we had a number of funding announcements through the federal government, including a $970 million Conference Board of Canada's low-interest loan to Darlington, $970 million to support the Darlington SMR, Canadian Infrastructure Bank, thank you, the Darlington project. Just last week, the federal government announced an investment tax credit of up to 30% for all clean technologies, including nuclear. So that was the first time that the Canadian federal government has recognized nuclear as part of its clean portfolio of projects. So that is really going to help us to advance nuclear projects in Canada. So a huge amount of stuff going on. Finally, a funding announcement to help build capacity in our impact assessment agency, which is the agency that looks at the deployment, the siting, and the environmental assessments of nuclear projects. So again, great federal support, great provincial support in Ontario, and it's really set the stage for us to move forward and be successful in rolling forward and deploying these projects this decade.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. So maybe let's start by just kind of grounding ourselves. We've talked about all of the interesting things that are happening about nuclear and encouraging nuclear. Maybe let's just be provocative. Do we even need nuclear? So we're talking about this climate challenge, and Deanne mentioned energy security. So really, is nuclear a needed and necessary part of that equation? We often say that the best answer is going to be the teamwork and the dynamic of sort of all the different carbon-free solutions working together. But let's sort of build that case for nuclear. Does nuclear have to be a part of it? Dr. Huff, I'll start with you.
Yes, of course. There's plenty of modeling and analysis that's been done at the global level and at the national level. In the United States, the White House has a pathway to net zero document that we produced about a year ago. And it includes a bunch of analysis that supported what would eventually be the bipartisan infrastructure law policy choices and Inflation Reduction Act policy choices. And in that document, it analyzes a whole series of different scenarios. And in all scenarios, to get to net zero, we must at least maintain the current capacity of nuclear in the United States at that sort of 92 gigawatt electric level, which probably means building new nuclear, even just to replace the ones that may not be able to extend their lifetimes all the way to 2050. Though we do have great hope that there will be a lot of lifetime extension, almost certainly we will need to backfill that. Now that's the minimum of all of the scenarios. That was the lowest nuclear scenario, was keeping the capacity that we currently have. The highest nuclear scenario approximately doubles it by 2050. And I think that is a pretty good estimate of what we're going to have to do in the United States, especially when you just look out at the amount of coal capacity that we will have to replace. We can do some carbon mitigation on some coal plants. I fully expect that we will do that. But nuclear is going to be a really excellent choice to replace our coal capacity. It will really leverage the high voltage power lines and the cooling water and the workers at those locations to make sure that the transition is bringing all of those things along. Nuclear power is uniquely suited to this, and DOE released a report very recently that indicates that there are hundreds of coal plants that could be available for this, that are appropriate. About 80% of the combined retired and currently operating coal plants in the country could be replaced by a nuclear power, like a largely small modular reactors were the focus of this study, but the intent there is then that you can see the pathway, if you're going to replace 80% of our coal plants with nuclear, how we get to a doubling. And that doesn't even touch on the kinds of things that are extremely hard to decarbonize outside of the electric sector. It's hydrogen, it's, supporting that carbon capture and sequestration for things like, cement making, steel making, etc. So we're really in a position where nuclear heat can be used for a lot of things that are currently used, that fossils are used for. I would also add all different sizes of nuclear reactors are part of our plan in the United States. We see an opportunity for microreactors to support remote communities like those in the Arctic that currently rely on incredibly expensive diesel, right? There's no clear solution to the, energy needs that those folks have that has the kind of resilience and reliability that they need, that they currently get from direct high-priced fossil fuels. A whole variety of small modular reactor applications and gigawatt scale reactor applications are within the path here. So there's no reactor left behind. All right.
Great, thanks. And before I'm going to go, Deanne, but before I do, so Dr. Huff, you have recently come to government, and maybe just give us a reflection. What about the receptivity of nuclear? So from the job that you held, when you were a professor, and now your participation in the government, are you seeing a more openness to conversations around nuclear? How do you view that?
Yeah, I've experienced incredible bipartisanship on the Hill. I've experienced that the administration is very positive about nuclear. I've had a lot of great conversations on the international stage, I think bolstered by a lot of what you guys were already talking about in terms of, the combined need for energy security and clean energy. But I think broadly it's about the change in generations. We're seeing a growth in the number of young nuclear engineers as part of our field in the United States. And those young nuclear engineers and frankly young climate enthusiasts are very positive about nuclear as part of the climate solution in a way that, maybe wasn't the existential priority of other generations. But the existential priority of folks my age and younger is climate.
Excellent. And Deanne, as we look to Europe, they made sort of a big splash over the summer talking about an EU taxonomy and whether or not nuclear was going to be in it or not be in it. I guess share with us, your perspective on maybe how that conversation went, and then how does that either give you confidence or not that nuclear is going to be part of the climate solution in and across Europe and other countries?
It was absolutely a big policy debate in Europe, and the timing of it coincided with these two crises that I mentioned before: the climate crisis, which is an existential crisis, and the energy security crisis following the war in Ukraine. And the resulting policy debate in the EU, the decision that ultimately was taken, was that the EU taxonomy, which is a financial policy measure, or a financing policy measure, included nuclear in its package. And I guess I would sort of step back and create a little context for that, and share with you. It's a bit of sort of the NEA answer to the question you posed to Dr. Huff, but it's relevant here. Our analysis at the NEA shows that on a global level, global installed nuclear capacity needs to triple by 2050 for the net zero scenarios. We came to that conclusion that it needs to triple by looking at a combination of electrical and heat and synthetic fuel applications. We looked at the 90 pathways to net zero under the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. And those pathways paint a lot of different pictures about how the world could get from where it is today to net zero. And some of them are much more aspirational in terms of, let's say, carbon capture and storage or hydrogen, but they all aim to sort of get to that net zero point by one way or another. And if you look at the average role of nuclear across the 90 pathways, nuclear has to at least triple. So we took that as a starting point for our analysis, and then we started to look at how could nuclear achieve that tripling globally. And it's a combination of decarbonizing electricity production, and I'm looking at the pie chart that's on the wall here in the room. I don't know if you'll be able to see it on the video. There you go. So today, around the world, nuclear provides 10% of the world's electricity. But if you take a closer look, you'll see that more than 60% of the world's electricity is provided through unabated fossil fuels. And that means that 60% of global electricity production needs to be decarbonized. It's impossible to conceive of how you would do that without significant expansion of nuclear. And let's not forget that the size of that overall pie is also going to grow because energy is needed and electricity is needed for economic development, and to lift billions of people out of energy poverty, we're going to have to grow that overall pie. And let's add on to that this is the electricity part of the puzzle. This is actually the easiest part of the economy to decarbonize, is electricity production. We also need to decarbonize heat, much more challenging, and we need to decarbonize transportation, which probably requires new innovative ways of creating synthetic fuels. So our view is that nuclear has to play a role in all of those. Now, that's our view as an international organization. When I look at the European landscape and I think about how that policy debate over the EU taxonomy played out, I think energy security factored into that. I think there were definitely specific countries in those negotiations that looked at their domestic options. And if you're not a country that is blessed with hydropower potential, if you don't have a lot of water power potential, you have to firm up your non-emitting electricity production from somewhere. And so there are quite a few countries in the European landscape that are looking to nuclear power to do that.
Thanks, Deanne. Lots of really good comments there. So Gary, OPG has recently made some pretty big announcements. You're both refurbishing one of your large plants, the Bruce Power plant, and you're also looking to expand your fleet. And I know OPG specifically has made some announcements about technology selection, etc. So help us understand, why did OPG choose to make these investments, and how have Canadian policies played a role?
Sure. So first off, earlier I said that we've decarbonized, we've removed our coal stations. We're over 93% clean. So one would argue, well, why do I need to do anything? I'm pretty much already there. I agree with my panelists here that we need to start thinking about doubling or tripling of the electricity sector in Ontario, and that's not going to be possible without nuclear. So we'll start off there. But it's going to include all the tools in the toolbox to get there. We're looking at further expansions of our hydroelectric business where we can, but there's no solution without substantial expansion of our nuclear fleet. So first off, we need to sustain the nuclear reactors that we currently have. So you are right, the design of the CANDU reactors require a mid-life refurbishment to extend their life for 30 more years. Both Darlington and Bruce are currently in the midst of those refurbishments. Pickering is also being considered for potential refurbishment of that reactor. That'll, like I said, give us 30 more years of clean, safe power for the province. When we think about decarbonizing, I know this is Decarbonization Day, and again, to echo my panelists, we also need to look at the opportunities to use nuclear in industrial settings. So whether it's mining or petrochemical or hydrogen for fuels or potash mining or oil sands in Western Canada, we are looking at how do we utilize high temperature nuclear reactors to help with their energy requirements as well. So getting back to the announcements, so we have announced that we are moving forward with a small modular reactor, a grid scale small modular reactor, GEH BWRX 300 at Darlington. We have approval to build one by the end of this decade, with plans to build 3 more by the middle of the next decade. We are doing further evaluations of the sites that we have in Ontario and evaluating what other nuclear opportunities would we deploy on those sites, whether it be more small modular reactors or the potential for large reactors on some of those sites. We are also working with ultra-safe nuclear company in a joint venture called Global First Power to deploy a micro-modular reactor at Chalk River, a full-scale demonstration project, a 5 megawatt, 15 megawatt thermal project, with a goal to as Dr. Huff said, we have large remote communities in Canada that are serviced by diesel, and the opportunity to give them clean electricity, but also steam for desalination for water, heat for residential uses or agricultural uses, is certainly something that we see a big future for. And of course, the third announcement we've made is our partnership with X Energy for those industrial applications, looking to find work with partners to help them solve their energy needs with OPG as an operator, a licensee of those units, to work together in a collaboration manner to help deploy nuclear and help decarbonize Ontario.
Wow, that's fantastic. So, for those of us that have been in the nuclear world for a long time, the fact that you're not just talking about one technology, you've mentioned 3 technologies, and then you said you're not just going to build one, you've already talked about wanting to build multiple. The natrium reactor as well in the United States, very, very similar, right? They announced one, they're building one, but they've already announced plans, for 4 or 5 more. Just to give a flavor of how unusual that is in our business, right? That's not really a nuclear play that people are used to seeing, right? They want to build it and operate it for a while, really check it out. But you already have the line forming, and the first one isn't even built yet. I mean, that in and of itself should sort of trigger us in terms of the level of sort of hunger and interest. Like Deanne said, people are looking for an option that needs to balance with the renewables. And so you can just feel sort of, I'll say, maybe a pent-up energy or a pent-up hunger, appreciating that people have made some pretty interesting commitments, and I think they're trying to figure out how to make them come true.
And we've seen, you're absolutely correct. We've seen that with, we made the announcement of BWRX. TVA is following suit with the deployment of BWRX technology. Saskatchewan has announced they will deploy 2 units of the BWRX technology by the middle of the 2030s. We're working with Poland Synthos Green Energy to also deploy SMRs in Poland BWRX technology. Other countries such as Estonia are working with, we have a subsidiary called Laurentis Energy Partners. It's working with Estonia to help them make their decision and support them in deployment of nuclear reactors. And these are states that have never deployed nuclear before and are looking to nuclear to help solve their energy security issues as well as climate change and decarbonization goals.
Excellent. So we've concluded that we do need nuclear. You guys all had some great examples of how we know. We actually didn't bring up affordability, but I'll just add that there's also been many studies that have said, well, let's try to do it without nuclear, and then sort of some of the challenges that come up. And one is a reliability challenge, and the other is an affordability challenge. And for the scale of things that we're trying to do across the globe, if we decide the only answer is it has to be really, really, really expensive, it's not going to happen, right? It's not going to happen. People are just say, wait a minute, but I want to have electricity. I want to have energy. And so it's really very important that when we add nuclear to the solution, an appreciation that it actually becomes much more affordable. So, Deanne, let me go to you next. We've talked about the fact that we need it, but it's hard. And so what are some of the challenges that we're seeing? I know you see so many different countries in your members. And so what are some of the challenges? And then what are some policy changes that you think sort of begin to get at these challenges?
So let me start by looking back several decades and acknowledging that in many of our member countries, the landscape has changed dramatically since our members have built new nuclear. Not all of our members, but here I'm thinking of some of the nuclear leaders, historical nuclear leaders like the United States, Canada, France, Japan, Korea, UK. In the recent decades, to different extents, those countries have restructured and in some cases privatized many aspects of the nuclear sector. So most of those countries decades ago would have been running vertically integrated national state enterprises for their nuclear sectors. And in many of those countries, some of those businesses have been divested to the private sector. National labs have a private sector presence. Different aspects of the supply chain, even the R&D wings of different operators have been privatized. So the landscape in the nuclear sector itself is different, but then also the societal context is different. You have much, much higher expectations of the citizenry today for transparency, accountability, engagement in the public policy making and decision making process, higher expectations for environmental assessments, environmental protections, engagement of Indigenous people. And so the policy context has also changed. And what this means is that even those countries that have a history and an expertise in nuclear are going to be trying to deploy new nuclear in a different world than the last time they did it. And so at the Nuclear Energy Agency, this has us thinking about what are some of the implications of those changes? How will they affect the ability of countries to succeed in their ambitions? And part of what it means is that you now have a lot of different actors that are not sort of centrally controlled under one decision-making hierarchy, that all have to be rowing in the same direction to achieve success. And that means the policy frameworks have to give that long-term, clear signal, but you also need to have national labs pointed in the same direction, and regulators ready and able and having the capacity to review and license the types of technologies that are in the national interest. You have to have universities lined up, generating that talent pipeline. Again, in areas that are related to the technology direction of the nation, the private sector, and all of the aspects of the supply chain, from the large engineering firms right through to the small and medium-sized enterprises, and the operators, the fuel production. You really need a lot of what are frankly independent actors rowing in the same direction. And so that has us thinking about what are the blind spots and what are some of the possible gaps where we could fail as a global nuclear sector. If not everyone is rowing in lockstep, because it doesn't do you any good to have 7 out of 8 of your necessary players reach the finish line if the 8th one you needed was left behind. You need everybody moving together. And we're seeing some conversation now about how to grapple with that and different approaches. So in Canada, the SMR roadmap and the SMR action plan was one way of convening the new groups and the new players in the space. In the UK, there was an announcement to create Great Britain Great Britain Nuclear. And I think they're still debating exactly what role that organization should play, but the motivation to create the organization was clear. It was to tackle this question of how to succeed in the new landscape. And in Korea, they call it Team Korea. When they have a nuclear project, they have a specific way of organizing their supply chain and their procurement process. And so these are sort of different ways of approaching and trying to solve, but what is kind of a universal challenge for those countries that have not maintained state-owned enterprises. So I think this is one of the areas where we really need to be paying close attention and making sure that we're bringing everyone in the right direction together.
Well, thanks, Deanne. You brought up a lot of good points in that. You talked about there being a lot of different players and how we have to get them all aligned. Gary, if you could reflect on how are you doing that in Canada? So you have a big appetite. You've already talked about sort of several different makes and models. Well, you're going to need supply chain to build those. You're going to need a workforce to build them and to operate them. Is Canada already thinking about sort of how do we encourage that? I mean, I know we're thinking about it in the United States.
Absolutely. Start off with from a supply chain perspective, the decision to refurbish our nuclear plants in Ontario gave us a head start on the supply chain. We had a stagnant supply chain because we hadn't built new nuclear for a number of years. So by going through the refurbishment, we invited new industries, new vendors to come in to the nuclear supply chain. So what we're now doing is, as we wrap up our refurbishments, we're going to extend the opportunity for those supply chains to be in the new nuclear business. And so I think we have a great starting point in that place. When it comes to resourcing this and understanding how you get to that, that end state, we started talking about 1 BWRX at Darlington. We really need to start talking about 13 plus gigawatts of nuclear in Ontario over the next 15 to 20 years, or you won't get to the point of having people get excited to show up for those types of conversations. So we're now talking about this bigger vision of where we need to go. We're starting to hold conversations with resources, with unions, with schools, to start to get them engaged. One of the things that is a challenge in Canada and probably elsewhere in the world is the trades folks, skilled trades folks that are needed to execute the number of projects that we're talking about. So we're out there talking to, girls in grades 7 and 8, boys, trying to get them to think about trade school and the opportunities that those careers offer, and explaining to them the variety of things that they can do and the excitement opportunities that are available to them. Indigenous communities, having programs to bring Indigenous peoples into the industry, into trades, into the nuclear industry. You name it, we're talking to just about anybody, trying to help them understand that the opportunities that exist in these future projects that we're working through. We're not going to be successful OPG on its own. We're going to need to collaborate with industry, with schools, with federal government, provincial government, from province to province. We'll work together. It's going to take all of us working together in harmony to get to this end state.
Excellent, thank you. Well, Dr. Huff, I'm going to come to you next. My goodness, there have been so many announcements coming out of the Department of Energy over the last couple of months. In fact, I think you had a recent one as early as this morning. And so as you look at options around building out supply and including fuel supply, what are some thoughts that you have on that?
Yeah, thanks so much. If you weren't up at night watching the DOE Twitter, you might have missed it, but our demonstration for high-assay, low-enriched uranium at a small scale in the United States had reached the end of its first phase, the construction of the centrifuges. So we competed the second phase, the operation and startup and demonstration of that cascade for HALEU production in Piketon, Ohio. And we announced last night, if you were in Egypt, and yesterday midday, if you were in the United States, that the selectee for that award is Centrus. So I'm really excited to say congratulations to Centrus. They will be completing the demonstration of that cascade by starting up and operating those centrifuges. The intent, of course, is that they should be in the full demonstration operation phase by 2023, producing 900 kilograms of high-assay LEU by 2024. This is a small amount. So congratulations to them. But this is just the beginning, right? This is a $150 million first step award, and will be, there may be options in the future to continue that cascade. But this is, before we even really get started with the implementation of our Inflation Reduction Act, $700 million, which will seek to make a request for proposals from industry to generate more high-assay, low-enriched uranium in support of the advanced reactor fleet that we expect to come online soon. That $700 million will include at least $500 million in offtake agreements from consortia of HALEU producers. But even that is not going to be enough. When we talk about low-enriched uranium, including HALEU, these components, the demonstration at Piketon and the potential for the IRA funding to support significantly more, ideally about 40 metric tons by 2030, are probably going to be needed for our advanced reactor fleet of HALEU. It doesn't even touch the low-enriched uranium that we need for the world's largest fleet of reactors. In the United States, we consume 2,000 metric tons of 5% LEU a year. And 20% of the conversion and enrichment capacity that we rely on to feed those reactors is from Russian sources, right? It's from 10X. And so, we intend to bolster our conversion and enrichment capability in the United States with similar offtake agreements as we're envisioning for high-assay, low-enriched uranium. We're looking forward to partnership with trustworthy allies, while, of course, we're also focused on expanding our domestic capacity for those things. We haven't gotten that part funded yet, but the Biden-Harris administration is working with Congress to find a solution so that we can support that front end of the fuel cycle in the U.S. It's huge, and it's the most critical part of the supply chain, in my opinion, as we think about energy security. Maybe second would be the skilled trades workforce. This is going to be a big issue too, but thank you for that.
Well, thanks, Katie. Wow, my goodness, we've had lots of conversations. So we've concluded that we do need nuclear to be part of the solution. Even if we need nuclear, it's a lot of it. So she says triple it worldwide. You said double it at least in the United States. And, again, just to imagine that scale. So, in the United States, if you're talking about doubling, if you did it with small modular reactors, and I'm not saying you have to do it only with small modular reactors. I imagine that there will be big, medium, and micros. But if you did just do that with small modular reactors, it would be 300 small modular reactors. Now you're talking 300 between now and 2050, just to give people sort of a flavor. When we're talking about you need a lot of these things, that's a supply chain and a workforce and some challenges that we really need to get in the rhythm, if you will, of getting these. And that doesn't even talk about sort of the regulatory process, right? Our regulator hasn't been involved in a build out of a nature such as that in decades. decades, maybe one would argue ever. So lots to happen, and that means what? It means we got to work together to make it happen. And I know the U.S. and Canada, particularly, we're both interested in the BWRX 300, and I know we're working very collaboratively together. And I know, Deanne, that you also see all of your different member countries with various levels of interest. There's a lot of work to be done here, and the best way to do that, right, is to work together to figure out regulatory processes, supply chain, workforce. You know, we spent a lot of time talking about the climate, and I believe you mentioned it as well, Dr. Huff. As important as the climate is, energy security is now eclipsing the climate conversation in many countries. And that doesn't mean that the climate's not important. It just means that the immediate wolf at the door, if you will, is energy security. And what's interesting about that is nuclear does both, right? Nuclear is able to provide that energy security, and it's able to be a huge part of the solution for climate security. Well, thank you very much. You did a fantastic job. Great conversation. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists.